Much, Molly. Welcome everybody to the Udall Center's periodic, though not regularly scheduled, set of presentations by Udall Center Fellows. And let me hand it over to Bob, who coordinates the Fellows Program.
Thanks, Chris. Well, this is the first talk of the year by one of the fellows for this year. We had one last week, but it was a leftover. So I want to welcome everybody, and particularly welcome Tom, and point out that normally we normally do these things with lunch, and we'll have to remember never to invite Tom when we're providing lunch, because we've never had 40 people for a fellows talk. In fact, we couldn't possibly fit them into our conference room. But it's great that this is one of the advantages that Zoom and the period we're in seems to provide, that more people can see a talk like this by a distinguished scholar. So that's great. For those of you who don't know, we've been doing this program for a really long time, since 1990. And I've had the privilege of being involved from the beginning. So it's a particular pleasure for me, because every time this happens, I get to hear the talks. So I'm one of the prime beneficiaries of this program over the years. Normally what we do is we go around and we allow everyone to introduce themselves, but I'm afraid that there are too many of us on this. So I think we're going to forego that and just turn it right over to Tom. And as I do that, I'll point out that this is his second stint as a Udall Center Fellow. And somewhat remarkably, what he's done, and that happened in the late 1990s. I don't remember if it was 1997 or 98, Tom, but remarkably, what he's working on this time around is very related to what he worked on all those years ago, 23 years ago. So this time, what we're doing is we're pioneering a new kind of Udall Center Fellowship, and this one is in partnership with the Udall Foundation, and in particular with the Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution, because the Udall Foundation has put up funding this year to allow us to recruit and look for a scholar working on environmental conflict resolution. And lo and behold, we got Tom. So here he is. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Tom.
All right. Thank you so much, Bob. It's really an honor to be awarded this fellowship. And as Bob said, it's sort of like coming full circle, because in 1997, I had another Udall Center Fellowship, and I was working on the political ecology of ranching on both sides of the US-Mexico border. And so while I was there, Les Corey and Andy Lorenzi of the Arizona chapter of the Nature Conservancy came to Dr. Kirk Emerson at the Udall Center, who was running the environmental conflict resolution program there, and said, look, we've gotten off on the wrong foot with the ranching community, and we want you to help us better our relations with them. And so I got drawn into that process, and eventually it led to the creation of what we called the Arizona Common Ground Roundtable, which was run through the Udall Center and became a statewide forum to discuss many of the issues that I'll be talking about today. So this is a very personal experience for me, because it sort of completes the circle in my professional career. And the other group I want to thank are Pima County and all the incredible people at Pima County who worked on the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan. It was one of the honor and privileges of my career to be able to participate in the SDCP. And County Administrator Chuck Huckleberry really put together an incredible collection of talent. People like Julia Fonseca, Linda Mayrow, Carrie Baldwin, and of course, Maveen Behan, who was taken from us far too early. And also all the other groups that contributed to the plan, especially the Arizona Land and Water Trust. And I noticed that Diane Freshwater is listening in today, and the Arizona chapter of the Nature Conservancy. So it's really an honor and a privilege to be here. And with that, I'm going to share my screen and launch right into my talk. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, that looks great.
Okay. What I want to do with this fellowship and the study that it's kicking off is to look at the larger context that allowed the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan to even be possible. And to do that, my kind of theoretical framework comes from the work of Henri Lefebvre, a French philosopher who wrote a really fascinating book called The Production of Capital, and critical geographer David Harvey, who looked at the spatial impacts of capitalism over the last century or so. And this quote right here sums up what Harvey had to say about the sort of spatial trajectory of capitalism. Having this fellowship has given me the time to begin to think through this. And right now I'm envisioning it occurring in 3 sections. And today, primarily, I want to focus on the first section, which is what are the demographic, economic, political, and cultural developments in Pima County that made the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan possible. First, a brief, very brief summary of the plan itself. It was triggered by the 1997 listing of the Cactus ferruginous pygmy owl as endangered. And the county very wisely decided that rather than dealing with the listing of species as either endangered or threatened on a case-by-case ad hoc basis, the county would try and get ahead of the curve by developing a multi-species habitat conservation plan to try and figure out what were all of the plant and animal species that might be impacted and threatened by the rapid development in Pima County over the next 20, 30, 50 years. Habitat conservation plans allow for the incidental take of species in question, provided measures are taken to avoid, minimize, mitigate take, primarily by protecting critical habitat elsewhere. And to pay for the plan, the county decided to let voters decide. And in 2004, a majority of Pima County voters voted to pass a $170+ million open space bond that enabled the county to purchase every major ranch that came up for sale over the next 6 years. It also led to the creation of the conservation land system in Pima County. And the multi-species habitat conservation plan, which covers 45 species, not just those listed under the Endangered Species Act, was recently signed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And here you can see the spatial impact of the SDCP. This is only eastern Pima County, and you can see the dark green is the biological core of the conservation land system, while the light green is the multiple use recovery management areas. So you can see that almost all of eastern Pima County and much of western Pima County is included in this SDCP and the conservation land system. The Pima County Board of Supervisors adopted the biologically preferred conservation land system in 2001. And their comprehensive plan imposes mandatory guidelines and restrictions on all requests for rezoning in unincorporated Pima County. This represented a radical change in direction for the Board of Supervisors, because until 1997, the board had approved almost all major requests for rezoning from developers. So what made that change? But before I begin to get into that, I want to talk about some of the teeth that the comprehensive plan has. So for example, if you're a developer and you want to develop a new subdivision on 100 acres in the biological core, you have to leave at least 80% of that acreage, 80 acres, as natural open space. And golf courses do not count as natural open space. So this has real impact on development in Pima County. If you want to develop more than 20% in that biological core on the property you may now own, then you have to purchase critical habitat elsewhere and set it aside at a ratio of 4:1. And as you can see down below that, again, that increases the amount of acreage that has to be preserved in order for you to go forward with your development. Now, the major hypotheses so far that are governing my research, and I want to talk about hypothesis number one for the rest of today, is that the orgy of real estate speculation and development during the real estate boom of the 1980s triggered a counter reaction that led to the formation of a very broad coalition that supported the protection of open space and biodiversity in Pima County and supported, in particular, the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan. To do that, you have to understand when the plan took place. The SDCP was developed and implemented between two of the biggest real estate booms and busts in Arizona history. The first was the deregulation and the subsequent savings and loan crisis of the 1980s. And you can all remember Charlie Keating, who was kind of the dark prince of deregulation in Arizona at the time. The second was the Great Recession that began in 2008. So those two booms and busts bookend the particular time when the SDCP was being developed, implemented, paid for, and approved. Right now, I'm primarily looking at that first real estate boom and bust. And to do that, you have to understand what was happening in the savings and loan industry in the 1970s. And again, this is personal for me because my father was in the savings and loan industry and was president and CEO of two savings and loans in Arizona between the 1950s and the 1970s. Savings and loans, some people refer to as thrifts, primarily made low interest loans for single family homes. And they really kind of hit their stride after World War II as the real estate and industry boomed and more people, including veterans, could afford to buy their own homes. But that strategy really ran into trouble during the high interest inflationary economy in the 1970s. So a 30-year fixed rate loan at 6% really didn't bring in much money when you had 13.3% inflation, and you could only charge a 5.5%, pay a 5.5% interest on new deposits. So the savings and loan industry was being strangled by inflation. And because of that, Federal Reserve Board Paul Volcker tightened the money supply so that interest rates soared even higher and triggered a recession. So the savings and loan industry was insolvent by $150 billion on a market value basis by 1982 when deregulation occurred. Because of that, free market ideologues demanded that the savings and loan industry be deregulated. And two crucial pieces of legislation were passed during the early years of the Reagan administration. The first was the Depository Institution Deregulation and Monetary Control Act, which phased out restrictions on the interest rates savings and loans could offer, and increased the federal insurance on deposits from $40,000 to $100,000. The second was the Garn-St. Germain Depository Institutions Act, which accelerated the phase out of the interest rate ceilings and authorized S&Ls to make commercial, corporate, business, and non-residential real estate loans. So in other words, savings and loans could invest in just about everything, not just offer mortgages on single-family homes. So the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, the major federal regulatory agency that regulated savings and loans, removed the 5% limit on brokered deposits. So now brokers could bundle individual deposits into $100,000 CD, certificates of deposit. That gave savings and loans access to an enormous amount of cash. Brokered deposits rose by 400% in the early 1980s. And those S&Ls could make risky investments because the federal government was backing those investments up by insuring deposits. And it helped create the so-called casino economy, when profits from speculative investments, in other words, fiddling with money, became the primary form of profit making rather than producing goods and services. So real estate speculation was one of the new means of production in the casino economy. So this quote from Business Week captures the really peculiar convergence of forces that was happening in the 1980s. Risk-taking was being backed up by the federal government. Instead of facing market forces that might have mitigated that risk-taking, the federal government gave managers of thrifts free rein to invest in Arizona. Rampant real estate speculation and land fraud kicked into high gear during the post-war boom. For example, Don Bowles, the reporter who was blown up in the late 1960s, estimated that there were 6 million lots and 1 billion in fraudulent land deals before deregulation. You had the so-called swampland swagger of Florida-based Gulf American at Rio Rico. But deregulation allowed billions more of speculative capital to pour into Arizona real estate. And the real estate boom of the 1980s was followed by the bust of 1989. And I see the research that I want to do for this project kind of taking off where my book, Landscapes of Fraud, left off, which looked at 140 years of unbroken land fraud in southern Arizona from the 1840s to the 1970s. Now I'd like to push that into the present. And just to look at the toll that deregulation took on the S&L industry in Arizona. By 1989, Arizona banks had lost more than any other state. 10 of the 11 Arizona savings and loans were in a receivership by 1992, administered by the Resolution Trust Corporation. Western Savings and my family knew the people who ran Western Savings well. By 1988, only 25% of their loans were single-family mortgages. The rest were in speculative real estate. So let me go back here. So by the time Western was taken over, I wrote in my Arizona history that it was the third largest bloated body among the 700 corpses littering the savings and loan industry. This cost taxpayers about $5 billion. And then, of course, the better known story of Charlie Keating, who parlayed his American Continental homes with about $500,000 in assets and $100 million in debts into the largest home builder in Phoenix and Denver after he bought Lincoln Savings and Loan in California for $51 million, which gave him $1 billion in assets to wheel and deal with. So this gives you some idea of the unprecedented scope of real estate speculation that was occurring all over the United States, but also in Arizona because of deregulation. Now, that raises some research questions that I want to answer in this study. Excuse me. How much capital poured into southern Arizona real estate in the 1980s and 1990s? What were the economic and ecological impacts of urban, suburban, and exurban development? Why and when did different groups of the environmentalist coalition emerge as political forces in the region? What were their values and motivations? And was Pima County developing kind of an alternate economy, one based on what I call amenity capitalism, services, industries, occupations that actually benefited from proximity to biodiversity, scenic beauty, wide open spaces, to counterbalance real estate speculation and the home building industry. And just to give you an idea of the spatial impact of this, Tucson, metropolitan Tucson grew from under 100,000 people at the end of World War II to more than 1 million people by the 1990s. And yet during this time, the population density of Metro Tucson actually was cut in half. It declined from 5,200 per square mile to 2,400 per square mile. When the SDCP started in 1997 and 1998, it was estimated that 5,000 acres of the Sonoran Desert were being bulldozed in Pima County alone per year. And one of my hypotheses is that triggered the so-called bulldozer in the countryside phenomenon, where many of the people who had moved into new suburban and exurban developments did so because they loved being out in the desert and they wanted the development to stop at the end of their street. My involvement in the SDCP, I was on the ranch, I was head of the Ranch Conservation Technical Advisory Team. I was member of the Open Space Bond Advisory Committee. And then after the Open Space Bond Committee, Open Space Bond was passed, I was appointed to the Conservation Acquisition Commission, which made recommendations to Pima County on what lands to buy with open space bond funds. Now I want to go back to make a few points about the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan and how I think it represented the production of an entirely different kind of space in Pima County. The critical group that developed the conservation land system was the Science Technical Advisory Team, which we all called STAF. And that was composed of biologists, federal, state, and county land managers who were charged with determining what species might be vulnerable to development as Pima County continued to grow at such a rapid rate, and try and determine what was the critical habitat or potential critical habitat of those species that had to be preserved. And very few of those species were so-called charismatic species. And so many had not really been studied thoroughly. So potential critical habitat represented the best guesses of these scientists and land managers working on the STAT team. One point I want to make about the SDCP is that it really was a grassroots community effort, even though Pima County spearheaded it. Hundreds of citizen volunteers like myself worked on this project. We devoted literally hundreds of hours crafting various parts of the SDCP. And I really hope that Pima County considers this one of its most enduring legacies, because it really is probably the most ambitious rural land use plan in the country. So what the STAT team did after they developed these priority vulnerable species is they mapped the critical habitat or potential critical habitat. And wherever the maps of 5 or more species overlapped, that became the biological core of the conservation land system. So you can see much of eastern Pima County and parts of western Pima County were considered biological core. And I would argue that critical habitat is a radically new form of space. That doesn't necessarily mean that the desert was transformed by it, but it certainly helped shape what could be done, what people could do in that space. The biological goal of the SDCP was to ensure the long-term survival of the full spectrum of plants and animals indigenous to Pima County. And one of the most, I think, innovative and beneficial parts of the SDCP was that it developed the preservation of working ranches as a critical element of the plan. The Pima County decided that working ranches, primarily cattle ranches, had defined Metro Tucson's urban boundaries for more than a century. It was an important traditional industry. It was important to the heritage and culture of the rural West. It conserved water resources. It defined the urban boundary. And it was perhaps the best and most efficient way to protect open space and biodiversity on a large landscape basis. And that's what the SDCP is. It is an experiment in the conservation of large landscapes, including working landscapes. And these are actually slides that I've stolen from county presentations themselves. So you can see that ranch lands in Pima County, eastern Pima County, largely overlap with the conservation land system. So the preservation of those working ranches was critical to the preservation of open space. Now, most of the suburban and exurban development in Arizona was taking place and still is taking place on the private lands that used to belong to ranchers. Because ranches in Arizona are mosaics of private lands, the base property of the ranchers themselves, and then grazing allotments on state trust lands and federal lands, primarily BLM and Forest Service lands. Less than 15% of Arizona is in private hands. So the private ranch lands of Arizona are critical targets of real estate speculators. The key to the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan's success was in keeping an old form of space, i.e. working cattle ranches, in business to create its new form of space, which was the conservation land system. So between 2004, when the open space bond election passed more than ever, gave Pima County more than $170 million to either buy or conserve open space, Pima County bought every major ranch that came on the market. Here I want to acknowledge the critical role that Diana Freshwater and the Arizona Land and Water Trust pay, because in most cases, the agreements between ranchers and the county were crafted under the radar between the land trust and the ranchers before the county stepped in. And then what the county did, because it did not want to run these ranches, was sign multi-year agreements with the ranch former owners to keep the working ranches working. So The other thing that I think is critical about the SDCP is it saw that sustainable working landscapes, in this case, cattle ranches, were absolutely critical and integral to large landscape conservation in southern Arizona. And that opens up all kinds of possibilities in the future for these ranches. But I think at this point, I'm going to stop, and I hope that we have a chance to have lots of questions from the audience. So Molly, can I turn it back over to you?
Yes, definitely. And actually, if Bob wants to chime in and help moderate some questions too, that's fine. Do we have any questions from the audience? You can feel free to put it in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself and you can ask your question directly.
Yeah, let's take the slides off, Tom, so that we can see people.
All righty.
And we'll
How's
open
that?
it up. Thank you. And that was great, Tom. Thanks very much. Let's give him a silent hand. We've got 52 people, which is definitely a record for us. And so far, no questions. So
this is Brooke Bushman from the Nature Conservancy. I had a question.
Please.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about the what was going on in Tucson in the political environment when the bond was passed and why it passed? Why you think it passed?
Well, that's one of the things that I really want to find out more about in this study. My hypothesis was that, you know, the rampant real estate development in Arizona triggered a counter reaction, and it broadened the coalition of environmentalists to include neighborhood associations, scientists, ranchers, and even some realtors who wanted to slow that development down. And I also want to acknowledge the critical role that the Arizona chapter of the Nature Conservancy, particularly Rob Marshall, played in this process. Because Rob Marshall and Diana Freshwater were really instrumental in helping give the Conservation Acquisition Commission a much better idea about what were the, you know, biologically preserved areas of eastern Pima County that needed to be preserved. But, you know, I actually have, you know, that is a hypothesis at this point. But, you know, the fact that until 1997, the Board of Supervisors approved almost every major request for rezoning. And then that changed, and it really began with the fight over Canoa Ranch, south of Pima, you know, south of Green Valley. When this broad coalition mobilized, and I took part in that, to oppose Fairfield Homes' request for rezoning. And for the first time in the modern history of the Board of Supervisors, the board turned down that request and then negotiated with Fairfield Homes and ended up purchasing nearly 5,000 acres of the area that Fairfield originally wanted to develop and turned it into, you know, the Pima County, the Raul Grijalva Historical Park. So I can't definitively answer your question yet, but that's the direction that I'm going in.
Well, stay tuned. Thanks.
Thanks. And I see there's a question from Amanda Smith from the Sonoran Institute. Amanda?
Hi. Yeah, I'm wondering, between 2004 and 2010, when Pima County had the funds from this bond, to what extent did they also use state and federal funds, such as grants that may no longer be available, to match the bonds when they were acquiring the ranch lands? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a question. I don't know if Linda Mayrow or Julia Fonseca would like to address that, because they would have a much better handle on it than I would.
Hi, everyone. This is Linda. There were some grants. We used some Section 6 grants for, which are the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service grants, to purchase an area out in the Coyote Mountains. It's called Hayhook Ranch, the original part of it. That supplemented bond dollars. We used some, we also used historic preservation bonds, grants to, again, match in part some of the bonds. I don't have a definitive number, but we did seek out monies to leverage the bonds. We can probably provide some follow-up answer, but I can just tell you purchasing the Coyote Mountains is 864 acres or 34 acres. That's one grant I'm certain we use for open space ranch lands.
Linda, this is Kerry. We also use some Department of Transportation funds for some of the projects along I-10 at Barvey Ranch and also down on 286.
Okay, if there are
There
no
were
other
also
comments
some
on that.
Arizona Preserve
Sorry.
Initiative. This is Julia. There were also some Arizona Preserve Initiative state monies used to acquire lands as well.
That's correct. We purchased 67 acres of a large archaeological site called the Valencia site that adjoins the Santa Cruz River. And we also purchased 320 acres on the west side of Tumamoc Hill to preserve the original Carnegie Botanical Laboratory lands.
Okay, we have a question from David Sewell.
Oh, sure. Just wondering if you had preliminary thoughts on why all of the bond proposals in 2015 were voted down, including the conservation ones?
Yeah, well, that is another, that's sort of the third section of this research that I want to look at. Originally, the county planned to hold another open space bond election in 2008. But we all know what happened then, when the real estate boom of the early 2000s went bust and the US entered the so-called Great Recession. So I think the county very wisely decided to postpone that, thinking that in that dire economic climate, voters might not be inclined to pass another big open space bond. And it kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed. But meanwhile, all of the pressure, not only from environmental groups, but from all the other, cultural groups, human welfare groups in Pima County built up. So that by the time that the county was ready for another bond election, it had grown to about $815 million, of which I think about 100 million was for open space bonds. And I think possibly it was too big. It was too complicated for voters to wrap their heads around. There was still, even though the economy was recovered, there was still this hangover from the Great Recession. But again, that's something that I want to look into further. And one of the things I want to do with this project is collect oral histories from key players not only in the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan, but also in the real estate industry, to try and get a better idea on the, the kind of the general economic and political patterns that were changing voter attitudes in Pima County at the time.
Just to add a bit to what you said, Tom, preceding all of this, maybe 3 years before that, I think you'll remember that Bob Sharp went to Chuck Hutchinson, a colleague, and Chuck brought him to the Udall Center, and his concern was that as a big ranch owner who was eventually going to leave the ranching business, he was going to be faced with huge taxes.
Right.
And he wanted to know how the ranching community could somehow get out of their ranches without paying these large taxes. And I think that's a point you haven't really touched on.
Right. We touch on it in this book, Stitching the West Back Together. I actually wrote a short section on the estate tax.
Mm-hmm.
And like a lot of land trusts in this country, I believe that there should be an agricultural exemption from the estate tax that would mitigate and lower taxes that owners of large agricultural properties would have to pay as long as those properties remain in agriculture, including ranching. So, in a talk like this, I've really only been able to skim the surface of, the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan is so complex and has so many moving parts, and really tried to make use of all kinds of conservation tools. Not so much conservation, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm blanking on a term I know really well, but tools like land mitigation banks, the sale of conservation easements, selling the right to develop your private land in order to keep a ranch in your possession, but you would never be able to turn the private land that you continue to own into a real estate development. And the SDCP talked about all of these different options and explored all of these options. And they'll all be a part of the toolkit as the SDCP moves forward. And I don't know whether Carrie or Linda or Julia would like to talk about that in greater detail. But I've only been able to, skim the surface of a very, very complex process. And what I'm trying to understand now is the bigger political, economic, and cultural context that allowed this remarkable plan to take place. And, I think there were some really unique particulars as well. The fact that one Republican supervisor died prior to the development of the plan and was replaced by Ray Carroll, that helped give the Board of Supervisors an actual majority in favor of the SDC plan, I think was very critical. The fact that you had a county administrator who was very, very well respected, very powerful, had been in the position for a long time, and was able to recruit all of this incredible talent to Pima County to work on this project, is another thing that I haven't been able to talk about. But hopefully I'll be able to address those questions as I go further in my research.
Great. We have a question from Chloe Fandel. Chloe?
Hi, yeah, thank you. That was a really good talk, thanks. I was wondering what some of the possibilities being considered are for all of those lands, the working landscapes that the county acquired. Because you mentioned they originally had multi-year use agreements, but when the original landowners either want to retire or when those agreements expire, what is the next step?
That is one of the big questions of the SDCP. And, you know, I think it's probably already beginning to happen as the original owners get old. I don't know if Carrie or Linda or Julia would like to comment briefly on that.
Tom, this is Carrie. I think when we first acquired the properties, that question was a lot harder to see in the future than it is today, to be honest. I think we have a better vision, and Brian Powell's down there somewhere, and Brian could probably talk about it more from a current perspective. But initially, I think we were all very concerned about what happened as those older family patriarchs quit ranching completely. And we didn't know what that future looked like in terms of bringing other people on for those properties, or what else did the county really want to do with those properties. And I think over the period of time, we've seen opportunities where people have left those agreements and they've been picked up by other ranchers to carry on the conservation value sets that were established by the county. So I think there's still a strong audience out there. I think there's a stronger audience out there today to partner with the county over those lands and those ranches than we might have thought about 10 years ago. I think the other thing too is that we're seeing some changes in ranching in Arizona. And one of the things that I think I've seen and makes a lot of sense to me is that we're going backwards in one context, in that a lot of those small non-profitable ranches that we had in the 60s and 70s and 80s are going away. And so what we're seeing is larger ranches. So there's a consolidation going on, and I think the larger ranches are the only way that they stay profitable in the long-term future. And I think that bodes well for the county as being a place where either existing ranchers can expand to or can grow into over time.
Great.
Carrie, by the way, was head of the county natural resources. And help me out, Carrie, what was your position?
I was the Natural Resources Division Manager at NRPR. So I had the responsibility for managing all the acquired properties.
Yeah, hi, this is Brian Powell. I just want to follow up on what Carrie was saying. We're actually, Vanessa Pralison, who is the range program coordinator, is in the process of developing what I think is a pretty innovative RFP program for succession. So when a rancher leaves an agreement, there's going to be a process by which we're going to solicit proposals from interested ranchers to take over those to the leases. And we're going to see that, I think, coming up in a couple properties here in the next year or two. And then also one of the ranches, the Barvie Ranch, which is at I-10 and Highway 83, we have turned that into, we have a resident cowboy living there. We have some cows that the county owns, and we'll be doing a lot of educational programs because it's fairly close to Tucson. So that's another innovative program that Vanessa has been spearheading.
Okay, Kirk Emerson, you've got a question, Kirk?
Hi. I was just curious how things would have played out had the fragile economics of ranching in the 90s not motivated people to consider these alternatives and place their spreads on the market. What if the cattle industry had been booming? How would that have affected the plan's strategy?
That's a good question, Kirk. And, you know, Kirk again was very instrumental in this whole process, especially during the early years when we created what we called the Arizona Common Ground Roundtable. I think that's an open research question. And, you know, one of the things I want to do is do oral history of ranchers who've been involved in the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan and get them to talk about, you know, what motivated them to put their ranch on the market and then ultimately to sell it to Pima County. You know, and one thing you have to realize is that much of those ranches were purchased during the real estate boom before the bust. And on the Conservation Acquisition Commission, we were told that land prices in Pima County were rising by 1% a month during this period. And that the value of most of the ranches in Pima County, 75–80% of the value of those ranches weren't based on their value as productive cattle ranches. They were based on the speculative value of the ranchers' private ranch lands. And during this time, real estate speculators were, you know, they were kind of like vultures poised over every ranch, poised over state trust lands, which can and are auctioned for sale. When those state trust lands around Phoenix and Tucson were auctioned off, speculators were paying anywhere from 4 to 20% of the appraised value of those ranches during this period. So when the open space bond money was being spent, this was the economic context that Pima County had to compete with when it tried to acquire those ranches. My gut feeling, my hypothesis is, given their druthers, most, if not all, the ranchers who sold their ranches to Pima County would rather have sold them to the county than to real estate speculators, because that would keep them in ranching. But then that's again something that I really need to look into.
Tom, I would, Diana Freshwater would have a good insight there, but I would say, having sat down with a lot of those families after the ranches were acquired by the county, my personal perception was it was a lifestyle issue and a generational issue rather than an economic issue. Most of the folks that we bought ranches from were pretty independently wealthy already, and or had a fairly large operation going on, of which a particular ranch we might have acquired was only a part of it. And it was really an issue of either the family didn't want to be in ranching any longer, or the family didn't want that particular ranch any longer, and got out of it that way. But it was really not the economics are a real part of that process, but that wasn't, to me, the motivator for them to finally come to the county and work with the Arizona Land and Water Trust. Diana, did you have that sense?
Well, we've lost some people. We may have lost Diana, but I'm going to say that some people probably have other things on their calendars, and it's a little past 2 o'clock. So I think we're going to thank Tom for an excellent talk and an excellent set of questions and answers, and hope to see you all back the next time we have one of these, and Molly will notify people. So thank you, Tom.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Stephanie.